3, hi from Amelia Island, Florida, site of the ACC spring meetings. You can tell by the lovely flower shell thing behind me. We're in a tropical paradise. It's not exactly paradise for the folks of the ACC right now. It's a very strange meeting, and we'll talk about that. But there's a lot of different things to talk about in regard to this meeting, because you've got Florida State suing the ACC in Florida, the ACC suing Florida State in North Carolina, Clemson suing the ACC in South Carolina, and the ACC suing Clemson in North Carolina. So you've got all those lawsuits. You also have drama surrounding North Carolina happening as the meetings are happening, but back in North Carolina. And I think that may have been by design as well. So we're going to talk about what's going on with the Tar Heels, what's going on with the Seminoles, what's going on with the Tigers, and what that all means for the ACC. And oh, by the way, Charlie Baker, the president of the NCAA, came to talk to the coaches and the ADs of the ACC, gave him a little, given the applause at the end, it sounded like a little pep talk, but he came and talked to us. So we're going to have a little bit from Charlie Baker as well later in the show. But it's a fascinating situation. It's interesting because I think you'd assume that everybody be at each other's throats and people would be really awkward around one another. Not. These guys have to meet a lot. And so if you're the Florida State folks, if you're the Clemson folks, if you're the ACC folks, Boston College, Wake Forest, like, you're used to this. You've been dealing with this now for over a year, really. And so it's interesting to watch them joke around with one another when they're around each other and realize, oh, wait, these people are kind of at each other's throats, if we really think about this. But there was a piece of movement. It wasn't movement, really, just something that happened in a board meeting at North Carolina on Monday that could impact all of this as we go forward. And again, what the NCAA president was talking about will impact all this. Nothing's said. And this is what I keep reminding people. We keep talking about what the playoffs going to look like in 2026. What will regular season schedules look like in certain conferences? Don't worry about that. There's some stuff that's got to get figured out first that will determine the membership of all these conferences. And remember, this time last year, we still thought the Pac-12 was going to make it. We still thought the Pac-12 was going to make a TV deal and wasn't going to fall apart. So there's more change to come. We don't exactly know how that's going to manifest itself, but there's more coming. Before we get to that, before we get to what happened with North Carolina and what was so interesting, and then we're also going to talk to Ira Schoffel of War Chant about Florida State, about where they're at in terms of them in the ACC, but also in terms of the Seminoles on the field, because they're planning for a pretty exciting season. Let's talk about some kickoff times. We have actual kickoff times. This is that time of year. So the networks that broadcast the Big Ten games held their draft last week. And they basically picked, like, Fox says, we're taking Michigan, Ohio State. We're going to put it at noon on that Saturday. Of course they are. But they've done that. And so now we have a better idea of when things are going to be. And they're starting to roll these out and they roll it out at a trickle to get us excited about this. And it's pretty exciting. We saw a couple of times announced on Monday. We're going to see more as we go. The SEC usually holds off until they have their spring meeting in Destin, Florida, right after Memorial Day. So I would imagine a couple of weeks, we're going to get a bunch of SEC kickoff times. We got a couple of kickoff times at Big Ten stadiums on Monday, both involving non-conference games, both involving games I guarantee you want to watch. First one, week 2, Colorado at Nebraska. Now, we all watched this game last year in Boulder. Remember Nebraska, horrific turnover issues at the end of the first half. Colorado just torched them the rest of the way. It was full-on Coach Prime mania at that point. Then you go, that led into the week of the Colorado State game, where game day and big noon kickoff were at Colorado in Boulder. That game, that Colorado State-Colorado game, that kicked off at 10:30 p.m. Eastern time and drew 10 million people. And it was an overtime game, very exciting. So that's the game everyone has to see. This is remember, Coach Prime in Colorado opened with TCU last year. So that was big time. It was a noon Eastern game. It was on Fox. They start with North Dakota State this year. And we are going to get to see that one too, because that one's going to be played in prime time. So we'll get to watch that one. But This is probably not the North Dakota State of 5 years ago when they were winning the FCS every single year. They're still good, but I don't think you're going to go into that game thinking that North Dakota State is going to be favored in that game. So, like, Colorado's supposed to win that game. Nebraska's playing UTEP. They're supposed to win that game. So this will be the first one where it's a question. We don't know what's going to happen and what will emerge from this game in Lincoln. 7:30 p.m. Eastern time on NBC. So this is NBC, which is now broadcasting Big Ten games. They were doing it last year too, but their inventory for last year's Big Ten games were not great. It's better now. As you see, they're going to get a monster game with Coach Prime. Matt Rule, everybody's very excited about what he's doing. Dylan Raiola, we'll have probably seen him play one game at that point. That's going to be a big one. The following week, Alabama goes to Camp Randall. Alabama at Wisconsin. That's big noon kickoff. Fox is like, we'll take that one. We'll take Alabama any chance we can get. That's going to be noon Eastern, 11 a.m. Central Time. So 11 a.m. local in Madison, 11 a.m. local in Tuscaloosa. And it's interesting with the SEC folks because I think they're going to have to get used to more good noon games as well because ESPN's going to want to counter program the really good noon games that Fox has on. Now, they're not going to put their best games there because they are going to want you to watch at 3:30 Eastern Time and at 7 and 8 Eastern Time for those good SEC games. But they're not going to just leave that real estate alone. And I'll say, one of the things about Fox moving that big game to noon, its biggest game to noon, is it has really improved the rest of the day because it used to drive me nuts when you'd have College Game Day. And I talked about this. I was on RJ Young's show, which is a Fox show. And so I'm talking about ESPN on a Fox show. And I felt a little bad about that, but not really. But it always used to drive me crazy because you'd have College Game Day there at the site of the most exciting game of the week. Everybody's going nuts. Lee Corso puts the mascot head on. Yeah! Or boo. Like, it is big time energy. Everybody going crazy. And then we take you to Ryan Field at Northwestern for Illinois at Northwestern. And it is empty and it is quiet and you can hear individual people speaking in the stands. Like, that drove me nuts. So I did appreciate when Fox moved that big game to noon, you saw ESPN try to counter program with some better SEC and ACC games, or when they had a good Big 12 game, they try to put that there. So I hope that's what continues to happen. I hope they don't just say, look, Fox, you got some really good games there at noon. We're going to leave that alone. You do your thing. Let's have some options here. And not too many. Don't put all of the good games on at the same time because that was the problem before when they try to do them all at 3:30 p.m. Eastern, or they try to do them all at 8 o'clock Eastern time. But spread it out a little bit. Spread the wealth. I like it. I'm very excited about both those games. Can't wait to watch. Cody Belair, remember, told you during our Big Ten ceiling floor discussion, he thinks that Alabama's right for an upset in that Wisconsin game. I'm not so sure about that. We're supposed to have Luke Fickell on soon. I don't know that I'm going to ask him, hey, you going to beat Alabama? Because I don't think he's going to answer that question in any sort of satisfactory way. But we will ask him about that game and what it means for them, because I am fascinated by Wisconsin as they evolve in year 2 under Luke Fickell. We saw some big changes there. It didn't go the way Luke Fickell had hoped. And it looked, kind of more like his first season at Cincinnati, though it wasn't that. He inherited a pretty bad roster at Cincinnati, went 4-8. But to the Wisconsin fans, what they did last year probably felt like 4-8. They're like, no, we fired Paul Chryst. It's supposed to get better. It didn't really get better. Like when Tanner Mordecai got hurt, they were not what you wanted them to be. So Tyler Van Dyke comes in from Miami. That offense, I would assume, will run a little bit better if he can stay healthy. But that will be a very tough challenge. Kalen DeBoer bringing Alabama in, and it'll be the first big game for Alabama as well under Kalen DeBoer. So it's going to be very exciting to see those games. All right, speaking of excitement, let us get into this North Carolina intrigue, because like I said, I'm at the ACC meetings in Amelia Island, and one of the kind of big mysteries of all this is we know what Florida State wants to do. We know what Clemson wants to do. They have sued the ACC. They want out. They want to try to get into the Big Ten of the SEC. They want to close the revenue gap. They've said this over and over. One more overtly, that's Florida State. One more quietly, that's Clemson. But we know what they want to do. The one that feels like kind of the linchpin of all this is North Carolina. North Carolina is one of those, if you talk to the SEC people going back years, like when they were taking Texas A&M and Missouri, when they were planning out the SEC network, North Carolina was kind of always the one that was the one they really wanted. They wanted to add the state of North Carolina, the footprint, the brand of the University of North Carolina is big, even though their football is not as good as other schools. And like right now, their football is not as good as NC State's football, but the brand of UNC is what everybody wants. The Big Ten would like it too. The longtime commissioner of the Big Ten, Jim Delaney, North Carolina grad. And so you kept thinking, okay, where's North Carolina in all this? How do they feel about all this? But the other piece of it is North Carolina politically has to tread carefully here. They've already been attached to NC State by their state legislature. They also are a charter member of the ACC. They've been entwined politically with the ACC. And I would say that other members of the ACC would argue that maybe favored a little much by the ACC over the years. And so it is very delicate for them. But like Rick Flair in our comments, and listen, Rick, I appreciate it. I heard you visited my town of Gainesville the other day. I don't know that went as well as everybody had hoped, but you do have some good points about North Carolina here. If it is indeed you, Rick Flair, many-time world champion, nature boy, jet flying, limousine riding, kiss stealing, son of a gun. All right. Does UNC want to keep up financially? Does UNC want to continue to support its thriving women's and non-revenue generating sports? If so, the answer is so clear, even Andy Staples can see it. Rick is referring to the title of this show. Does North Carolina want out of the ACC too? And I think the answer is a little complicated because I think there are a lot of people at North Carolina who do want out of the ACC because they realize it is possible to jump into the Big Ten of the SEC. North Carolina is the one, if it got free, if they said, hand up, we're a free agent, let's go, they could go to either one. The Big Ten or the SEC would take them. And with Florida State and Clemson, you're not entirely sure. You think probably, yeah, one of them is going to take those guys. With North Carolina, there is no doubt. So here's what happened if North Carolina did say we're out. As I think that turns the tide in all of these lawsuits. Because the other piece of this is, remember, Florida State sued in Florida. Clemson sued in South Carolina. The ACC then sues both those entities in North Carolina where the ACC is based. Well, if North Carolina sues the ACC in North Carolina, then all of a sudden your home court advantage for the ACC sort of disappears because it's also North Carolina's home court. But I don't think North Carolina wants to take that step. I think they would like to leave that fight to Florida State and Clemson, but their board of trustees is getting a little antsy. You can tell. So here's what happened on Monday. So Bubba Cunningham, the North Carolina athletic director, is heading down to Amelia Island, Florida. He's coming down to talk to all the other ADs, to all the other coaches. He's supposed to be back in Chapel Hill on Thursday. There is a full board of trustees meeting on Thursday. They're supposed to have a closed session. He's supposed to talk to them. Well, during a special meeting on Monday, the board of trustees says, we need an audit of the athletic department, and we need to talk to Bubba Cunningham in closed session about the finances of the athletic department because there's a deficit and it needs to be addressed.
But the first budget that we saw was a $17 million deficit and a $100 million cumulative deficit in the coming years with no plan to address that, to mitigate that. So if I don't want anyone to think we're talking in code, there are real issues here, a real concern that one of our most valuable assets and something that really generates revenue is not being managed properly. So that is the need for the question and answer, and that is the need for the audit.
So that's trustee Jen Evans. So you heard what she said, $17 million deficit this year and accumulated deficits up to $100 million over the next few years from the athletic department. There's a subtext to this, but let's hear from the board chair, John Pryor.
I think, I have tried to get more information from athletics and have had a couple of meetings with the athletic director. And candidly, I end up with more concern and more questions having done that. In good conscience, I can't approve the budget that includes athletics in it. And I'm just going to say I'm going to vote no if that is what we have to do today. And I really don't see why we can't have an extended discussion on this, because I think it is imperative for the board to hear all of this in closed session. I don't think people understand the issue. I don't think they understand the level of bad data that has been provided. And I think it is incumbent on us to get it right, not just to get it done in a hurry because there's a deadline.
Now, look, the Zoom of the Board of Trustees special meeting at North Carolina probably doesn't convey the vitriol, like what that actually means. That's the chair of the Board of Trustees. Now, he's attacked Bubba Cunningham before. He did it about 3 months ago. But that is him really going in on Bubba Cunningham. And that's where this fight is happening. And so Bubba is at the spring meetings. We asked him questions about this stuff. He said no comment. He said, I haven't heard. I don't know exactly what's going on. And at that point, he'd been in meetings. This was all going on concurrently. And so that may be true. And also, he's going back there Thursday, so he's going to talk to them. So he's got to deal with that. But this is definitely a faction going after the AD who it believes has been too chummy with the ACC and has not agitated enough for something different. Now, Ralph Meekins, who's another trustee, he points out that Bubba Cunningham said all along these deficits were going to happen.
I've been meeting. We just had a meeting last week at the Rams Club, and our athletic director gave us a 1 hour presentation about where we are in our budget. And most of those shortfalls, as we all know, came from the pandemic.
So what he's saying is, look, Bubba told us this was all going to happen. You knew this. Why are you doing this now? Why this performative effort in a public meeting? You could have done this behind closed doors on Thursday. Why this now? So Brian Murphy, who covers Research Triangle Sports for WRAL, he talked to some folks, and he talked to one of the trustees, Dave Bullock, who's a former chair. Talked to Dave Bullock after the meeting, and you see where they're really going with this. So what they're saying is there's a deficit. You're running a deficit with a $134 million budget. Why are you running a deficit? Why can't you cover your budget? There's a way to cover your budget. You could be in a league that pays you $40 million more a year. You could be in the Big Ten of the SEC. That's what they're getting at. That's the end game here. So Dave Bullock tells Brian Murphy, it's not something that you can change with a snap of a finger. It's something we've got to be cognizant of. We can't sit back and cross our fingers and pray for pennies from heaven and thinking everything is going to quote unquote work out. We have to actively pursue what's in the best interests of Carolina athletics. Murphy asked Bullock, is he advocating to join another conference? Bullock tells Murphy, I am advocating for that. That's what we need to do. We need to do everything we can to get there, or the alternative is the ACC is going to have to reconstruct itself. I think all options are on the table. Okay, so this is more close to what Florida State was doing. Remember August of last year, I came on and like Florida State had this board meeting and it was wild. But it was a little bit different because the president was in that meeting. The athletic director was in that meeting. The board of trustees, the president, the AD were all on the same page. They were all singing from the same hymnal, and all of them wanted to get the hell out of the ACC. North Carolina clearly is not all on the same page because the AD is getting attacked by various trustees, defended by other trustees. This one is going to get really interesting because if this power struggle ends with Bubba Cunningham either coming out publicly and saying, we got to get out of here, or losing a power struggle, and the people who win it say, we got to get out of here, I think that speeds things along. I think that changes the math on this. We know North Carolina, if Clemson and Florida State could get out, would probably get out too. But they've been very politically savvy about all this. They've tried really hard to stay neutral, keep everybody happy. JW Noel says, fire Bubba and Boo. They're more loyal to the ACC. They are to their own universities. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I just think they're trying to thread a needle here. Boo Corrigan is the athletic director of North Carolina State. I think they're trying to thread a needle here. I think that's what's going on. But again, big picture, do not assume that any of this is done, that this is settled, that once the Big Ten took the teams it took, the Big 12 took the teams it took, the ACC grabbed Cal and SMU and Stanford. Oh, by the way, it's very weird to see the Cal and SMU and Stanford people. I was talking to Justin Wilcox, the Cal coach yesterday, and I'm like, how strange is this? He's like, it is surreal, because he's sitting there across the table from Duke and North Carolina and Virginia. But that's how weird all this is. It's not done. It is not done. We just don't know exactly how it ends. I keep saying, I think the ACC will come up with a number that if a school wants to leave, it can pay and it can get out. The deal is, remember, the TV rights allegedly attached through the grant of rights to the ACC through the length of this contract with ESPN, which goes till 2036. But according to at least one clause in one of Florida State's lawsuits, ESPN has to decide early next year whether they want to continue that on the back half of that contract, because it could end much earlier if they want it to. So all of this is up in the air. But I do think the ACC probably has a lot more to lose than Florida State, than Clemson, than if North Carolina jumps on board, because the worst case scenario for all of those schools is they stay in the ACC until 2036. Not they want all what they want. As you saw with the North Carolina folks, they don't want to run those deficits. They want that money. But it's not the end of the world. You can continue on. If the ACC were to lose at trial, the ACC cannot continue on. It would break apart immediately. So that is where the incentive comes from. And I think the incentive grows stronger to figure that out if North Carolina, if someone in charge, if their board of trustees just decides, hey, we've decided we're out. It certainly sounds like there's some people there who are pretty powerful agitating that way. And then there are other people on North Carolina's campus who don't want to be as overt as Florida State has been. It's going to be wild. We're going to find out more about this. But right now, let's talk about it through the lens of one of the schools that's been fighting this fight for about a year, and they've already filed their lawsuit, and they've been sued, and they're trying to get out. And oh, by the way, they won the league last year, but didn't make the playoff. We're talking about all that with Irish O'Fell from War Chant right now. All right, Ira, we were reminiscing about 2 years ago in that very spot, inside that window in there. Jack Swarbrick standing there and saying, we're about to have a two-sun solar system with the SEC and the Big Ten and their gravitational pulls. And everybody's like, yeah, whatever.
You knew what he was talking about?
I think so. And I imagine the AD at Notre Dame at the time would know these things. But like, how strange is it to think that, we've been coming to this thing for years, but now we sit here. Florida State is suing the ACC is suing Florida State. Clemson is suing the ACC is suing Clemson. SMU is here. Cal is here. Stanford is here.
It's wild. Yeah, it's wild. I mean, you think about just from where we were a year ago, because these meetings have been kind of, I think, as you said, things have been trending probably not in a great direction for the ACC for several years. And you kind of wondered, okay, would the ACC network save them? What could save, or realignment, what could save the ACC? And a year ago, we're here and never could have imagined what would happen in the next 12 months. Because now you're sitting here and they're all suing each other.
Well, and I was thinking about this as I was coming here. I think if you'd asked me a year ago, would there be no Pac-12 in a year? I still thought, even at this point, even in May of last year, they'll figure it out. Like they always figure it out. And then no. And now, Oregon and Washington end up moving to the Big Ten. You've got Cal and Stanford here in the ACC. And, the school you cover, Florida State, is in this, like, think about what's happened at Florida State in a year. You've had all the drama with the ACC. You've had a 13-0 ACC championship season where they are left out of a 14 playoff, which sort of underscored everything they've been saying all along. And so if you are Michael Alford, the AD at Florida State, how do you approach this meeting with all these guys? And I realize he's been meeting with people from the ACC for all this time, but like, how do you handle the big picture stuff?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge with, in a lot of ways, because you do have the normal operating business that has to take place. And like, I was thinking about, things like personal interactions, when Mike Martin Sr., Florida State's legendary baseball coach, passed away a few months ago, Jim Phillips, the commissioner, comes to the funeral, and he's got he and Michael Alford are giving each other hugs, and you've got former presidents and current presidents of the university there, and so these are people that have to work together, but then they're also having this really kind of epic battle behind the scenes. And I guess what it comes down to is I don't know that I believe the court system is going to ultimately settle all of this. I do think at some point they're going to have to kind of find some sort of middle ground.
I don't think they want the court system. I think ultimately, if it comes to that, somebody is having a very bad next few years.
It's going poorly for somebody.
Yeah.
And the process would take a long time. But that process is playing out.
Yeah.
And it almost has to be seen as kind of a compartmentalized, where when they're at these meetings, they have to conduct the normal business that they're conducting and kind of put that on the background. But it also looms over everything, because everybody knows Florida State and Clemson are the two biggest football powers in this conference, and they both are actively trying to leave.
Right. And they've got to play a football season in this conference that's coming up, that they are going to be in this conference. We have a schedule. Like, it's not one of those things that can change at this point. And that's the part that's amazing to me is they've gotten this far, and now, it looks like the cases are going to continue for Florida State in North Carolina, the one the ACC filed, and in Florida, the one Florida State filed, which we didn't know when they were both filed. We thought maybe that somebody would rule that, hey, you're going to do this in this other state, but no, the Florida court has said, no, we think that the ACC was venue shopping. So we're going to have this trial here. And the North Carolina court said, no, we're going to have this trial here.
And you have all these decisions along the way where you can see why both sides would kind of want it in their state. Because
I just want a home field advantage.
Yeah. And then the North Carolina lawsuit, or the ACC's lawsuit in North Carolina, the judge there is not really pushing hard for them to reveal the ESPN contract.
Right.
Some of these preliminary rulings, whereas the judge in South Carolina, where Clemson's suing the ACC, is like, you need to produce the ESPN contract. And Florida's the judge in the Florida State's case in Tallahassee is probably heading in the same direction. So you see where venue does play a part.
Well, and it gets very juicy if that ESPN contract gets revealed, because there are details in it. Like, Florida State drops this little grenade in its original lawsuit that says, there's a period in 2025, in February 2025, where ESPN has to opt in or opt out of the remainder of the ACC deal. Like, that's a monumental thing that we still, other than them putting it, we haven't actually seen where that is in the contract.
Yeah, that's funny, because like you said, everybody still has to report it as FSU is alleging, because again, they're citing the contract that nobody else has seen. I assume they're telling the truth, because
why would you lie about that?
And where would you come up with the specifics? Because they said specifically that the deadline was actually earlier, but then the ACC extended it.
Yeah.
Because as you said, we all thought the ESPN contract went till 2036 when the grant of rights extends to, and apparently it doesn't, or at least that's what FSU's alleging, and we'll have to see.
Yeah, and we don't know what's going to happen here. We talked about this quite a bit off air. The timeline of this is very difficult to predict, just because you're dealing with 4 lawsuits total in 3 different states, and you don't know where it's going to go. And then you don't know what the Big Ten will do, what the SEC will do, what anybody will do if, say, the ACC were to come with a number and say, would you like to get out? Okay, write us a check for this.
Yeah, and you know, these meetings used to be, we used to come to these meetings to find out where the championship games are going to be held,
yeah.
or
Yeah.
what are the overtime rules going to be, or things like that.
Yeah.
Now it's obviously a totally different discussion. But yeah, that is, the timeline is impossible to know. I still feel like it's going to be sooner than later, just because nobody's going to want this to drag on. And like you said, it's almost a game of chicken.
Mhm.
Nobody's going to want to lose this battle. So at some point, you feel like they'd have to come up with.
Well, and the reason I keep saying I think the ACC will eventually find a number that works, it's just, I'm just deducing logically, like, if Florida State and Clemson lose their lawsuits, they have to stay in the ACC till at the latest 2036. That's not what they want, but it's probably also not the end of the world.
Right.
If the ACC were to lose in any of these cases, it all disintegrates immediately. So, like, they have much more to lose than Florida State and Clemson do in this situation.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And they also, I think, you know, ESPN probably has more chips to play.
Yes.
And the ESPN's kind of a partner with the ACC in all this, even though they're not named in the lawsuits.
Right.
But in terms of, you know, ESPN can kind of move chips around. They can kind of have a say in how it, and ultimately how it's going to affect their bottom line. And they can offer inducements to these schools. Because like you said, you know, these other schools in the conference, they don't want to be left high and dry. So it comes down to, okay, what can the ACC and ESPN come up with to make it worth their while to say, okay, we'll let Florida State and Clemson leave for X amount of dollars.
Yeah.
And that part is going to be probably where it all comes down to.
Yeah. And you said sooner rather than later. And I keep thinking it's crazy because all of this stuff is interconnected, whether we notice it or not. But like this House versus the NCAA case that we keep talking about on the show. And I keep saying, I know it's a kind of a boring topic, but I promise you it affects everything. Like when they come up with a settlement for that sort of defines who's at the top group of college football. And you got to make sure the ACC wants to be in that, which I think they do. I think the ACC and the Big 12 both are going to opt into that. But will every single school? Right. You know? We don't know. We have no idea because we don't even know what the number is, the dollar figure is. So that's the craziest thing. I keep saying, I think if Florida State and Clemson were to get out, you're probably talking about 2026 playing somewhere else, wherever that is. And that's not far away.
Yeah. And I think there are people at Florida State that would love it to happen in 2025. Because again, I think it's just, they look at these numbers. And again, you know, as you said, we've been coming to this meeting for a long time. And 10 years ago or 12 years ago, when John Swofford was kind of talking about the revenue gap back then, you know, it was maybe $4, $5, $6 million, $7 million a year.
Well, you have a couple good donors and you've taken care of it.
But now, when you start about now and these projections, now we're talking about $40, $50 million a year. So from a standpoint of, like, as you said, it seems like it's not that far away. But if you were a school potentially making $40 or $50 million less than your rivals, it feels like
2 years is an eternity.
3
years is 3 years doesn't. That feels like all till the end of time, basically. So that's the part. The other part of it, as you mentioned, they're the two powers, Florida State and Clemson, going into this season. They're still the two powers. Like if you had to handicap, who do you think is going to be in the ACC championship game? One or both of those, probably.
Yeah. No, they definitely could be there without question. And really, that's kind of the challenge, I think, for, you know, Jim Phillips. You know, you think about the end of the football season, where, you know, Florida State's winning the ACC championship, and he's got to hand the ACC championship trophy to Mike Norvell. And it's kind of at a time where, you know, things are going in the wrong directions between the teams in the conference. Same thing with Clemson. If Dabo wins a national championship or gets his team to an ACC title or playoff berth, you know, the conference has to celebrate them and do everything in their power to help them. Because they represent the conference. But in the meantime, you're suing each other. It's just strange.
Well, I feel bad for Jim Phillips and all this. And I've been very critical of like his decision on the alliance a few years ago. But I also think he gets a lot of heat for stuff that he had nothing to do with. He inherited when he took the job, and it was sort of, the ball was rolling in that direction, and now he's trying to. And you know, Indiana Jones doesn't turn around and try to stop the bull. He keeps running. So that's the problem. But yeah, it is going to be a very strange season. But let's talk about Florida State this coming season, because we haven't gotten to check in on the Seminoles since spring practice, and you know, we saw DJ Uiagalelei before spring practice started, and I was surprised going up there and talking to him and talking to players around there that how quickly he meshed with everybody there. When you think about, oh, this guy used to be your chief rival's quarterback.
Well, the cool thing about him
Chief conference rival, I'm sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in the interview you did with him, I thought it came across. He is a unique human being, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's so mature, so self-aware, so smart, and he didn't go in trying to act like he is that guy, guy. He wanted to embrace what they do and join what Florida State's doing. And I think that was really.
I thought it was very interesting. Something he said, and Mike Norvell has confirmed all this. Like, he went to the official visit to Florida State without an offer, which in the transfer portal era for a quarterback who's been a starter at 2 power conference schools, like, that's almost unheard of.
Yeah.
Like, you get the offer and then you go.
Right.
DJ almost kind of bet on himself in that situation, because remember, Cam Ward was still out there.
Right. And what's interesting about that to me, and this isn't a slight on Cam Ward, I think he's a fantastic football player, but I think if you were making a decision based on, I think DJ was looking for who's going to help me get to where I want to get to.
Right.
And he saw
because
Mike
there's a lot of
Norvell.
questions about him
Right.
going to the next level. Otherwise, he'd already be there.
Right.
Yeah.
So he coming back for a 5th year, and he's third school, and he's trying to prove himself. But he looked at the landscape and said, Florida State's where I want to go. Mike Norvell can help me get to where I want to go. I like the way their offense is run. This is where he bet on himself, but he also identified what's going to be the best place for me. Whereas at Cam Ward, I mean, I think probably did that to some degree, but ultimately wasn't quick to make that decision. I think if it was about that, I think he might have made the quick decision to go to Florida State. Instead, he was trying to see the NFL, and then he ends up at Miami.
Now, I think Miami probably ends up being the best. I think both quarterbacks probably wound up in the best place
position
for them, because Cam Ward goes to work with Shannon Dawson, who knows the offense that Cam Ward's been in his entire college career. I actually can't Florida State, Miami. I can't wait for, by the way.
Oh, I know, it's gonna be awesome.
Yeah.
But I guess my point is I don't know. DJ's goal was a little bit more specific.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, Cam was still trying to figure out the big picture.
Yeah.
And you just I give DJ credit for knowing exactly what he wanted, going after it, betting on himself, and ultimately getting it.
Yeah. I think the Florida State team this year will look so different. But the part that I was going through the roster and going through who played last year, I don't know that people realize how many guys were rotating in that played pretty decent sized roles last year that are just sort of ascending into bigger roles,
especially on defense.
Yeah.
I mean, on defense, it's across the board. Zaire Thomas wasn't a starter at corner last year, but I think his upside's probably higher than Renardo Green, who just went in the 2nd round of the NFL draft. And he was basically the 3rd corner last year, but he's a big time player. Had a great spring. I think you look across the board at linebacker, DJ Lundy was not a starting linebacker. The 2 starters were Bethune and Deloach. But Lundy played almost as many snaps as they did.
Yeah.
He's one of the top tacklers on the team. He'll be a starter now. And defensive line, you've got guys that are stepping up as well. And again, it's more Darrell Jackson was at times maybe the best defensive lineman in practice, but wasn't eligible all last season.
That one's the interesting one to me, because I was thinking about it when Braden Fisk got drafted. I was like, okay, how do they wait, Darrell Jackson has been sitting there waiting to play, and he would have played last year if he could have.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of situations like that. But then they also did really well in the portal. And, Mike Norvell, as he does, I mean, he's done a really good job of marrying the two.
Yeah.
And, Marvin Jones Jr. from Georgia, who people may have forgotten about because he didn't do a ton at Georgia, but he looks like the 5-star kid out of high school who could be a game record defensive end.
Well, and he also doesn't have to come in like Jermaine Johnson did a few years ago from Georgia. That was a situation where Jermaine, was a rotation guy at Georgia, wanted to be an every down guy, wanted to show what he could do. So he goes to Florida State. He's instantly the best player on the roster. He's got to play every defensive snap. I don't think Marvin Jones walks into that.
No. I just looked back. I was looking at Jermaine's stats the other day. He had 70 tackles as a defensive end. But to your point, he was on the field every snap, and he was running plays down from behind and all that. No, you're right. It won't be that tight. There'll be more of a part of a rotation of 4 or 5 defensive ends. And so he may not have the same numbers as Jermaine, but I think you could have that kind of impact.
But I think that's part of the thing that the people have missed with Florida State. When we talk about the success that Mike Norvell's had in the transfer portal, if you notice, the high school recruiting has gotten better and better every year as they've won more. And it feels like the development is there, and the guys that they've gotten out of high school, they're now ready to play. And this is not the situation he walked into anymore. He's been recruiting off success for the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I think the thing from a recruiting standpoint, that is a knock on Mike Norvell and his staff is when's the high school recruiting going to reach there? I think you have to go back to his first 2 years at Florida State. He didn't get the bump that a lot of new coaches get because of COVID. His first year, he was part of that class. If you go think back to a lot of those head coaches that were fired that were hired in 2020, a lot of them are still not employed. A lot of them either lost their jobs or are on hot seats.
And at the time, he's trying to put together a class with guys that he got to evaluate when he was the Memphis coach.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it was a really tough situation. And I think unique to anything we've ever seen before, because really for a year and a half, they didn't get to go on the road and recruit. They build relationships. He didn't have a bunch of assistant coaches who had coached in Florida. So all these reasons, I think, really stunted their offensive recruiting. But where he got lucky was he embraced the portal and found success there with guys like Jermaine Johnson and Keir Thomas and Jay-Sean Corbin and all those guys early on. And that led them to get the Jared Verses and the Braden Phillips.
I also think some of the guys they took out of the portal early, and this is something I think pretty much every other program has now adopted, but they did grab some guys out of the portal who had 3 and 4 years of eligibility remaining. Yeah. Now, I mean, the ultimate of that is not actually a guy that Mike Norvell took out of the portal. It's a guy Willie Taggart took out of the portal, Jordan Travis.
Right.
But like I remember Fabian Lovett last year, watching him play and thinking, wait, he started his career at Mississippi State, but it feels like it feels like he's been at Florida State forever.
Yeah, no, you're right. It is. People talk about development as it can only happen with high school players.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you bring in these guys for 3 or 4 years, or sometimes 2 years, I mean, a guy again like Trey Benson and Johnny Wilson were guys who had not done a ton at their previous schools, come into Florida State, have good first years, and then really good second years, and now here they are playing in the NFL.
Yeah, this is where we remind the poor Arizona State folks that you had Johnny Wilson and Ricky Pearsall in your receiving core, and Jaden Daniels as your quarterback. Yeah, Herm Edwards may.
You got probation out of it.
Yeah, Herm Edwards may need to face some NCAA, not NCAA sanctions for breaking NCAA rules, NCAA sanctions for wasting that much talent.
Yeah, because they weren't good at the time.
Yeah, but it is amazing to think. But so, what happened last year at the end of the season? Do you see any lasting effects from that with Florida State, or have they been able to flush it and kind of move on?
I was worried about it at the time, I'll be honest, because it wasn't just that the guys were mad at the college football playoff committee. I think there was some feeling that they were let down because they bought into what Mike Norvell told them and what the staff told them, just win all the games and they can't keep you out of the playoff. Well, then they won all the games.
Which is a perfectly logical way to say it, because it's how it had always
happened.
been. Yeah.
It never happened. But then it did happen. So there was a little period of time where you started wondering, okay, are these guys going to question Mike Norvell? Are they going to question the staff? Are they going to question the school? But I've been really impressed since that time. They rebounded quickly. I think they got those guys, obviously the bowl game was a debacle.
Yeah.
And I understand why a lot of those guys didn't want to play. They wanted to get healthy for the draft.
Yeah.
And they were frustrated. So, but once they got past that, you saw them, the way they went after the players they went after in the portal, the way they retained guys. There were concerns about some of the guys on that team, whether they might leave, but they retained almost all of those.
Let's talk about that, because that feels like something Florida State was ahead of the curve on a couple of years ago. How do they decide how they're going to retain people? How do they decide you are important, you are a priority, we're going to keep? Because it does seem like they've not lost anybody really that they didn't want to lose.
Yeah, there's probably been a couple, maybe at most, and none of the high profile guys. But yeah, I think they have a really good, healthy relationship between the football staff, football program, and the Battle's End, their collective. And I think where they benefited was they weren't the first on the scene.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the schools and a lot of the collectives that were the first to the market and really went hot and heavy, just trying to sign whoever they could sign, make big signings and all that stuff. A lot of times they didn't know what the lay of the land was going to be or how it was all going to work out and how the NCAA was going to
It also feels like they were among the first that prioritized retention over
but I think
making
they
a splash.
benefited by not being the first in because they didn't make some of the mistakes that other people did.
Yeah.
So when they really got active, they realized that, okay, retention is a different ball game.
Yeah.
The NCAA is not coming after schools for retaining their own players and finding NIL opportunities for them. It's more so if it's seen as an inducement or something like that.
Now, are they kicking themselves for making a plea deal in that Alex Atkins case?
I think there are a lot of people who feel like I don't know if they'll officially say that, but they're definitely
because I mean, if they'd have waited another month, that's just disappears and
But no, they've done a really good job. I think the Battle's End's done a really good job of being And I think that whole marketplace has evolved to where now you have these collectives that all communicate now.
Mhm.
And so they know what the market is for certain players, certain positions. And so Florida State hasn't made the mistake of ruining their whole NIL structure by going out and trying to land some huge marquee player.
Reaching for a play. Right, exactly.
It's been more about keeping the guys that they have, and they've been able to do that.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it does feel like that roster's evolved so much every year, but they've managed to kind of play the same way. That the attitude seems the same. I'm wondering, someone who's watched that team, it feels like Jordan Travis was pretty integral to that.
Oh yeah, huge.
Without him, like, can DJ do that, or can somebody else in the locker room create that?
I think they were really fortunate at the end of the 2022 season that you had a bunch of like-minded guys: Jordan Travis, Jared Verse, Trey Benson, probably Johnny Wilson, Fabian Lovett, Jarian Jones. Those guys that all wanted to come back and play together because they knew they had a chance to win. And that's, again, that's the challenge is you got so many players are balancing NIL versus chance to win versus getting to the NFL. And I think they all realized at the end of that 2022 season when they beat Oklahoma that we could have a special year. Let's kind of go into this from the mindset of like, let's keep this together.
Yeah.
And so that was huge. And Jordan was a big part of that. And now he's going and talking to the other players about, hey, don't go somewhere else. Maybe you're not going to get the biggest NIL deal you could ever dream of, but we can do something special here. And I think, again, goes back to what we were talking about, why that team took it so hard when they got kept out.
Because they felt like they were sold this
commitment for a year to come back for this, because you didn't have guys go into the highest bidder in other schools. They all came back. Jordan was a huge part of it. Jared Verse was a huge part of it. And you see it now. Those guys come back to help recruit. Like Jordan was helping recruit DJ.
Yeah.
And you saw Keir Thomas and Jermaine Johnson recruited Jared Verse.
It does feel to me like there's some ownership of the recent guys because they helped Florida State get out of this hole that it was in. Like they feel proud that they've done that, and they can help move it forward some more. But and I feel like they can use that over the next few years here.
Well, for sure. And I think Jarian Jones is a great example. He's not as big a name as some of those guys, but Jarian Jones, I mean, he's talked about this. When he came to Florida State from Mississippi State, his mindset was, I'm going to go there for a year or two, and I'm going to the NFL. We ended up staying there for 4 years. And he's a guy that comes back throughout the spring. He kept coming back and was trying to coach up younger guys. Yeah. This is a guy from Mississippi, didn't originally go to Florida State, but now it views himself as much of a Seminole as anybody. Yeah. And that's the side that they've been able to hit on with the portal.
Yeah, and I think people don't realize that still does happen sometimes. Like somebody who's from somewhere else goes to a school, falls in love, loves being there, loves the environment. Like it still happens. It's just not as common anymore.
Yeah, it's harder to achieve. Yeah.
For whatever reason, Mike Norvell's been able to cultivate it within his program a little easier than some other people have.
Yeah, I think they've done a good job. Their whole staff has done a good job with that, and we'll see if they can keep it going. Because again, now the problem with winning 13 games is now people want that.
It's hard to win 13 again. It's hard. But here's the thing: they win 13 this year, they're making the playoff.
Yeah, no doubt this time.
Thank you, Ira.
Thanks, man.
Yes, obviously still quite a bit of angst over what happened last year. And at Florida State, you understand why they're still feeling very deeply about that playoff snub. But it's interesting because it's such a different team. But when you dig into it, and I chatted with Mike Norvell for a little bit on Monday, he's very confident in this group. There are going to be players that who played, as Ira was mentioning, some of those players who played quote unquote non-starter roles that were playing starter snaps. They're going to be there. Daryl Jackson, who was supposed to be playing alongside Braden Fisk on that defensive line, he's been there the whole time. They don't really have to break him in. And then they bring in some transfer. Marvin Jones Jr. from Georgia. Now, it's funny because I've mentioned to Mike Norvell, he's like, I remember when Jermaine Johnson came from Georgia and, wanted to be an every down player, had been a rotation guy there. And I was talking about that spring game the year Jermaine Johnson played at Florida State. And you could kind of tell in the first 2 reps that Jermaine Johnson was clearly the best player on the roster, far and away. And Norvell just laughs. And he's like, little bit different situation now, little bit different rest of the roster. around Marvin Jones Jr. That said, he's a freak. And if you've been watching, Florida State puts these videos out where Mike Norvell races players at practice. Mike Norvell is fast. He is struggling to keep up with some of these guys that they brought in. So it's a very interesting situation. Marvin Jones Jr., one of those guys, and he's big. So big and fast. And I think they're very excited about what he can be coming off the edge. This is going to be a very interesting year in Tallahassee, interesting year in the ACC in general. You've got Miami with huge expectations. You've got Clemson with big expectations again. We don't know what's going to happen off the field. A lot going on. But we do know, as I said to Ira, if Florida State goes 13-0, wins the ACC again, they're making the playoff. Now, the question is, will they be playing opposite an NFL game in the playoff? Because that was the other little piece of news that came out Monday. NBC has acquired a regular season NFL game on December 21st. What is December 21st? Well, that is the day of the triple header in the first round of the college football playoff. So there'd be a game Friday night, triple header Saturday. The NFL has said, don't do this. The NFL told the CFP, don't do this. We have an NFL Network triple header that day. We play regular season NFL games that day. Do not try to compete with us. They've said that. CFP is like, nah, we're good. We're going to go ahead and do that. So the NFL goes, okay, well, instead of on the NFL Network, we're going to put one of those games on NBC. And also Michael Mulvihill, one of the executives at Fox, says another one of those games is going to be on Fox. So if you're the college football playoff executives, if you're the ESPN executives who are paying for the college football playoff, you're like, oh boy. One, I hope those aren't flex games. Two, I hope those teams are bad. Because you don't want to pick a fight with the NFL. I love college football. You love college football. We're probably watching the CFP game. Well, I'm definitely watching the CFP game. Is my job. You're definitely watching the CFP game too. Most of America, probably not, though, if it's a halfway decent NFL regular season game. So this is their way of chasing the CFP off that date. So I'll be curious to see what the CFP decides going forward. I'm not as hung up on when you play those games. Does it have to be a Saturday? Does it have to? Because that week specifically, everybody's kids are out of school. A lot of people are taking vacation anyway. There's a good chance you're probably okay. You probably can watch those games Thursday or Friday if that's what it comes to. But that's not a situation where you're going to pick that fight with the NFL. And remember, ESPN that's paying for the CFP doesn't like that either because they're also a partner of the NFL, but now they've kind of gone against the family. So the NFL's doling out goodies to NBC and to Fox and not to them. So that's the other piece of this. Because remember, the NFL could have just kept those games on NFL Network, which is the hardest to get network that shows NFL regular season games. But instead, they put it on over-the-air television. This was a message to the college football playoff. The truth says, I'm flipping back and forth between CFP and NFL, unless you said, Andy, the NFL team stink. And I get that. And that's fine. Like, you're at home, you're watching, you can have multiple screens up. YouTube TV has the deal where you can put multiple games on different screens. I think in 2024, this is not the big issue that everybody seems to think it is, but the NFL is going to protect its turf. We know that. One group that always protected its turf that is very different now is the NCAA. I haven't talked about this much because, again, a lot of this stuff is dry. People don't want to hear about the NCAA. If you've been reading my work for a long time, following what I've done on the radio, watching these shows since I started doing them, you know how I feel about all this stuff. They had a scam going for a long time where they were keeping the money away from the athletes who deserve to get it. But one thing that's always been reliable is the NCAA has been a reliable villain. Like, that's going to, Mark Emmert, now he didn't have a mustache, but if he did have a mustache, he would have been twirling it the whole time. Like, we're going to keep the money away from these athletes. They're not talking that way anymore. So Charlie Baker, who's the new NCAA president, and look, he's a politician, former governor of Massachusetts. He got hired because of his political skills, and he's trying to put them to use right now. But hearing Charlie Baker talk about a potential settlement in the House versus the NCAA case, which it's going to happen. It's going to be multi-billion dollars. And what it is back pay, NIL back pay for former athletes who were denied the right to NIL payments. It's going to happen. And we know it's going to happen, but it's still weird for me as someone who's covered the NCAA for over 20 years to see the NCAA just quit, like just roll over. And yes, that's the right thing to do in this situation. But I was texting with a friend of mine who's also covered this for a long time yesterday, and I was like, do you ever remember somebody talking so openly about a settlement when it wasn't a case of, oh, we did something that is categorically horrible, that everybody in the world thinks is horrible, and we're just like, oil spill situation where of course they're going to settle. No, this is one of those where usually they say we think our case will succeed on the merits, and then boom, they settle. No, they're going to settle. They're saying they're wrong, and they're hoping that being conciliatory allows them to create a framework that allows them to move forward. We'll see. I still think they've got to collectively bargain with the athletes. I think that's what they're trying to avoid. I don't think they're going to be able to do that. But here is what Charlie Baker said. Good question from ESPN's David Hale to get this answer.
You've been pretty vocal in advocating for some progressive ideas to try to make some of these things work that have not been working. Did you find, as you talked through the settlement and other things, that you have a lot of support for that within the room of folks who are kind of frustrated with the chaos that is the current day?
Look, I think everybody would like to have to be in a position where they feel like they could plan. And in the current world we live in, planning is very hard to do. And the best part about being able to plan is when you can plan, you can invest. You can invest in your students, you can invest in your athletes, you can invest in your programs, you can invest in your future. And have some idea about what the ground's going to be like underneath you. And for me, part of it was about coming up with some basic construct, which is what the D1 piece was about last fall, and trying to see if that could help move the conversation along. And like I said, if we can land this thing, I think it gives tremendous amount of benefits to student athletes, the highest resource programs. I think it creates a lot of stability and sort of clarity for schools, and it makes it possible for all of us to start thinking about what the next act will look like as it rolls out, instead of feeling like you're just waiting for the next shooter.
So why is Charlie Baker so fired up about a settlement that's going to cost his organization billions of dollars? Because part of the settlement is this situation where the schools are going to agree, certain schools are going to agree to share a certain amount of money with the athletes. Now, I think the schools think it's going to be a cap of money. It's actually going to be a floor of money. It's going to say, we agree that we will share at least $20 million a year, 20% of our revenues. We don't know if it's going to be a dollar figure, if it's going to be a percentage of revenue, but they're going to agree to share that with the athletes. It's going to seem like a CBA in a pro league, basically, except they're trying to make it not a CBA. They're going to have to make it a CBA. But why does Charlie Baker like this so much? Because this is what he proposed last December, this Project D1. And it's a way to force the schools into new divisions, new subdivisions, where the ones who can't actually compete at this level are going to fall by the wayside. They're going to go find their own level. And the people that are making money on sports that have the giant TV contracts, they're going to continue doing this, and they're going to pay the players. So it's really a way to protect the other schools in the NCAA as well, by having the schools with the money volunteer to give it to the athletes, because you're not going to have lawsuits at the lower levels because those schools don't make any money. So there's nothing to sue for. So Charlie Baker will look like he saw the future if this is all how it comes to pass. And I think that's why he's doing this. But the other reason they're doing this is they think by making this grand gesture, by being a different kinder, gentler NCAA, that's going to allow Congress, or at least encourage Congress, to give them some sort of antitrust exemption so nobody will sue them going forward. In fact, Charlie Baker talked about that.
Do you guys, potential settlement, do you think that would help you with what you're asking for from Congress?
The most important part about the settlement, and let's face it, there's still a lot of work to be done there. The most important part about it is it creates some clarity and some sort of visibility on a whole bunch of issues that have been sort of roiling everybody for a while. And the other thing it does is creates predictability and stability for schools, but it also creates a tremendous opportunity for student athletes, especially at the schools that are most heavily resourced. And it creates a framework that then makes it possible to have a different kind of conversation with Congress. So in many ways, I'm hopeful.
Yeah, that different conversation with Congress still not going to go the way they want it to. They're still not going to be able to impose a salary cap on athletes without negotiating with the athletes. They'll get to that. They'll figure it out. But this is where they're at right now, and it's a very different place than the NCAA was even 2 years ago. So what happens now? I think you see this settlement will happen. You'll see various leagues opt in to committing money to paying the athletes. And I think the conferences are going to be the SEC, the Big Ten, the ACC, and the Big 12. Those are the ones that are definitely going to be able to afford it. We will see if some of the Group of Five leagues can do it. We will see if they can put that money together. I don't know that everybody's going to make it into that level from those leagues. I am pretty sure that everybody in the leagues I just mentioned can do that. And I think that's where the line gets drawn, or at least they hope that's where the line gets drawn. Again, what we were talking about at the beginning of the show with Florida State, Clemson trying to get out of the ACC, maybe North Carolina is trying to get out of the ACC, or at least some people at North Carolina interested in getting out of the ACC. That's the worry, is that line gets moved up, that it's not those four leagues, it's something different. Maybe it's just the Big Ten and the SEC, but a larger version of the Big Ten and the SEC. We don't know. Again, this isn't over. If I told you last year what the conferences would look like right now, you probably wouldn't have believed me. In another year, when I'm back here, when I've got this shell thing behind me again, I don't know what it's going to look like. This could be a completely different group here. We'll see. But that's part of the offseason intrigue. We got a crazy 2024 season coming, but there's some wild stuff that's going to happen even before we get there. And of course, we'll cover it all here. Heading back over to the hotel for ACC meetings today. We'll talk to more ADs, to more coaches. We'll have more friends on the show talking about what they are talking about there, about what is happening, about what these conferences might look like going forward. And we'll talk to you tomorrow.